Dr. Cruz, thank you for joining me again. So another important issue on the forefront of everyone's minds today is this concept of terrorism, particularly international terrorism. And yet this is a very tricky topic to study and to understand. I mean, certainly since September 11th, 2001, we've had a global response and concern about international terrorism. But terrorism really isn't anything new, right? We've seen this kind of activity for some time. But yet, what is this activity? I mean, how would we even define this, Dr. Cruz? I mean, this is where we get into something a little tricky.
Yes, as you mentioned, terrorism is very difficult to define, and no one really has agreed on the definition. Most would suggest that this is a tactic that is used, a method, and that the goal is to create chaos, to delegitimize a government or to delegitimize a way of life that's occurring. The State Department here in the United States, for example, defines terrorism as premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against noncombatants by subnational groups or clandestine agents, usually intended to influence an audience. So that's a bit of a mouthful. And other departments within our country can't even decide if that is exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about terrorism.
But the bottom line there is that it's subnational groups, so not governments, right?
Although that is somewhat controversial.
That's right. So, but subnational groups that are targeting civilian populations, non-combatants.
Again, what is a civilian? How do we classify a non-combatant?
And they're targeting them for violence for the purpose of creating terror and fear.
Yes, absolutely.
In order to accomplish a particular end.
Yes.
So these, if you break it into these pieces, but each piece, as you've just suggested, can be controversial and some might even say contradictory.
Absolutely. What constitutes a non-combatant? Now, we know, for example, with 9/11, which you mentioned, that those that perpetrated the events on 9/11 felt that those in the towers, that American citizens are combatants because they use the capitalist system and have perpetrated these ideas of capitalism and U.S. dominance. So they did not consider them as non-combatants or civilians. We certainly would, but that is a question that's up for debate.
Well, that's a critical issue, is that terrorists, of course, don't necessarily don't see themselves as terrorists. Yes. They see themselves as combatants, as fighters, as some might even say freedom fighters. They're trying to fight against something or for something that they find to be important. And yet those who are often targeted by that say, this isn't right. I'm not, wearing a uniform and carrying a gun. I'm living my daily life. This is a very, very tricky subject and very hard to define, and yet we see it on a daily basis. Let's move on from there to this notion of global war on terror. So obviously, since September 11th, 2001, we've had this so-called global war on terror, and we've been fighting it in many ways, militarily, of course, but also financially, trying to freeze assets and track down using intelligence and other kinds of capabilities, to arrest and detain potential terrorists. So this global war on terror, is that something that is akin to that global war on poverty, global war on drugs? Is this really something that we can fight and win a war against?
Well, it sounds very nice, and I think we would all agree that we would like to fight terrorism. We would like to not have a situation like 9/11, and we would like to protect ourselves and those around the world from having to deal with these situations. But just like the war on poverty and the war on drugs, there really is no way to see where we have success. Where is the end of this war? When are we going to be able to declare that terrorism is over or that terror is over? So it kind of puts us in a difficult situation. Now, are there tactics that we can use and have been using? Absolutely. We are going after different groups. We have a number of counterterrorism agencies involved in hunting down al-Qaeda, amongst other groups, and we do fight terrorism. Now, whether we can successfully fight a war on terrorism, probably not to the way that we would think.
So the question for students then is this, what is terrorism? How would you characterize terrorism? Who would you consider to be a terrorist? And in fighting that global war on terror, is it something that we can ultimately win? Or is it something that we can simply manage and minimize and hope to prevent to the best of our ability? Tell us what you think.